Hello, and welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. Today, we continue our movement through the general or Catholic epistles. That means the letters of the New Testament that weren't written by Paul. Today, we're going to talk mainly about the book of James. I'm going to have a couple of comments about 2 Peter and Jude. But James is a fascinating and wonderful, in my opinion, letter of the New Testament. One of my favorite ones, one of the most convicting ones as well. So you all may have heard that James has stirred up some controversy within the church, but I think it's a merited controversy. That is, James is a book that seeks to convict us and seeks to try to teach us some things that we may not want to learn. But also it has been seen to be in conflict with Paul. I think that's probably true in a slight way, but for the most part, there's actually a way of reading James, and I think the most clear way of reading James would suggest that James and Paul are actually talking about different things when it comes to faith and works. So we'll get to that. That'll be part of the meat of what we talk about today. So the book of James. Or the letter of James. It appears to be a letter. It doesn't have some of the characteristics of Hellenistic letters, so the conclusion is rather abrupt and weak. It is not clear about who it's being directed to. It is said to be to the 12 tribes in dispersion. The 12 tribes refers to Israel, but of course the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom aren't a part of Israel anymore at the time of Hellenistic Judaism, at the time of Jesus. So it's a bit unclear about what this is referring to. First Peter has some similar ways of talking about Israel, the 12 tribes in dispersion, the exile or the diaspora. So this letter does appear to be written to a Jewish community, to a community of Jews who follow Jesus, who have not abandoned Judaism. This seems to be perhaps one of the most thoroughly Jewish letters. It's not a Judaizing letter. That is, it is completely different from the kind of attacks that Paul is making on, it appears, people who are promoting Jewish faith. The letter of James doesn't tell us that primarily the Gentiles need to be circumcised or something like this, right? That's Paul's big problem with what he calls the Judaizers. The letter of James seems to be addressed to Jews who love the Torah, a bit like Matthew, right? Directed to a community of Torah-following Jews who also believe in Jesus. It's interesting, though, because James is perhaps the least... it's the letter of the New Testament in the book of the New Testament that mentions Jesus the least. If you notice, Jesus is only mentioned a few times in this book, and in fact, you can take out those references to Jesus, and it would sound much like other Jewish literature of the day. I don't think those parts about Jesus were added later. I think it just tells us about the quality or the kind of Christianity, the type of theology that James comes from and represents. So historically, Christians have claimed that this book is associated with James the Just, but it's really important for us to notice that even at in the earliest church, even when the kind of the earliest conversations about canon that we have, canon meaning the books that become part of the Bible, right, the New Testament. What is sacred scripture? A canon means you have a list of things that are either in or out of the Bible. And there was a lateness to receiving James officially into the canon when that was being decided. There actually wasn't an official statement from the Church Universal about canon until the 16th century. But there were arguments and discussions about it and conversations about it and a general agreement about what was in or out of the canon around the time of the Council of Nicaea. So that's the early 4th century AD. By that time, James, there was kind of an argument about James. And Luther, much later on in the time of the Reformation, the 16th century, he was arguing that the early church thought that James was not really part of the Bible. And he said that James conflicts with what Luther understands the gospel to be, and Luther thinks that James should be thrown away. He says it conflicts with Paul, and the reason he says that is that in James, famously, there's this conversation in chapter 2 about faith and works, and James seems to come very strongly at Paul's opinion that it is faith that saves us. A faith that justifies us, really. Salvation being something a bit different. But in any event, in Luther's day, the way of seeing it was that we don't need works, right? That's what Luther's big argument is. Luther says the Catholic Church is all about you producing works that'll kind of earn your salvation. Now, Catholic theologians don't agree. Like there are parts of the Catholic Church at the time of Luther that were abusing the ideas of indulgences and kind of buying your way into heaven. There were other parts of the Catholic Church at the time that weren't doing that and that weren't affirming of that. There's always been kind of a reform element within the medieval and early modern Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, that was always upset about these things too. You can also think of Luther as being someone who's an Augustinian monk. He came from the Roman Catholic Church. It was an internal reform at first, and then he eventually created a new institution, or at least started to. So all to say that it's a perhaps not fair characterization of Roman Catholic faith to say that the idea is kind of earning your salvation through works, but that was the way Luther understood it. And so he thought that Paul gave him this kind of ammunition to attack the Catholic Church by saying it's only faith, not works, right? James seems to conflict with that, because James does say that you have to have works. I mean, so James chapter 2, verse 14, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? And James is suggesting, no, faith can't save you. I mean, Paul would say, yes, faith can save you. So this argument between faith and works was really, really important. We'll spend some time discussing that today. But all to say that in the early church, the hesitancy to fully accept the book of James did not have to do with the conversation about faith and works. In fact, the teachings in James were revered within the early church. The problem was that it seemed difficult to connect it to the historical figure of James, the brother of Jesus, or James the Just, the very famous and important figure of the early church, a brother of Jesus described in Acts and described in Galatians as somebody who's really important in the church that emerged out of Jesus' death and resurrection in the Jewish community and eventually in Antioch near Palestine. So all to say, it is true that it's very difficult to connect this book to the historical figure of James mentioned in Galatians, mentioned in Acts, assumed to be a part of the group of the people who are called Jesus' brothers that is referred to in the Gospels several times. Some people have there are a lot of conversations about what this exactly means. But nonetheless, it seems true that James, it's a very common name in the ancient world, just like Mary. Mary and James and John are the most common names in Hellenistic Judaism. Just about half the women we have inscriptions for are named Mary among Jews of the time of Jesus, so it's a very common name. James, also a very, very common name. Jesus has several companions named James, and then also apparently a brother. So all to say, the connections there are difficult to draw between this letter and any of those figures. The book itself is unclear. It's also written in very good Greek, albeit with some Semitic phrases. So it does suggest a Jewish context, but it also suggests a context other than the uneducated son of a day laborer. This is, the Joseph's son, right? So James probably didn't write this. Now, of course, some people, if James gets to be very famous and an important person within a movement like the early church, then it's very possible that James can hire a scribe who can make his teachings sound better in Greek, right? So that's not a great argument against James being the author too. But all to say, the book doesn't make that claim very clearly, that it comes from James the Just, part of the church in Jerusalem or the church in Antioch. So it'd probably be better for us to say, we don't know. It's some guy in the early church named James. So that again, in the early church, there needed to be this connection to an apostolic person, a person who was part of the early community of Jesus followers, who was chosen by Jesus to be a leader, in order for that person to have their works included in the New Testament. That became a big issue. But as we said, there's a lot of these pseudonymous works in the New Testament as well, and that doesn't necessarily take away from their canonicity or importance. So we don't know who wrote this book. Some guy named James in the early church, probably. Brother of Jesus, maybe, I don't know. My personal guess is no. My personal guess is that this is someone who is writing in the name of James the Just, but to that community that's represented by Peter and James in Antioch, who is full of Jewish Christians. And we hear this, we hear a lot of characterization and denigration of some of the views of this community by Paul and by the author of Luke and Acts, who's much more positive about Peter and the church in Antioch than Paul is in Galatians. But at the same time, there does seem to be a conflict there, right? And we hear mostly from the Paul side of the equation. Whenever you hear one side of an argument, hopefully we think, what's on the other side of that argument? What's the other person think? Is that the way they would put it? So we might be getting the other side of the argument here from the Jewish community of Jesus followers, that is, people who did not separate themselves from the synagogue, people associated with, say, the Gospel of Matthew, which assumes that you're going to be following the Torah. It doesn't talk much about Gentiles. It's not a big question for them, like it was for Paul. What do Gentiles do? The assumption here in the book of James is that Jesus is something that happens within the event of Jesus happens within Judaism and changes Judaism, but is nonetheless Judaism. Doesn't create a new category or anything like that. So James probably doesn't call them, wouldn't say I'm a Christian, right? James seems to be someone who's fully within the Jewish tradition. So Christian? No, probably not. At least not themselves. The other important thing here is that James talks about the law. Quotes from Leviticus, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus does too. But all to say, James seems to believe that Jesus has in some way impacted the way that people should understand and follow the law, but that the law still stands, the Torah still stands, that Moses is still a good guy. Paul would say that too, right? But it's a different way of thinking about the law and Moses, etc. So in James as well, we have, as I said earlier, very few references to Jesus. In fact, I think just 3. Mostly it's God is the word that's used to refer to the divine, and Jesus shows up at the very beginning of the letter. So James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. And then if you kind of read the rest of the letter, there's not a lot of discussion of Jesus' death and resurrection. There's not a lot of discussion about Jesus' teachings, although Jesus' teachings are assumed kind of throughout. That is to say, there's lots of similarities between the language in the book of James and what we hear Jesus teaching in the gospel stories. But it's not often quoted as such in James, that James isn't saying, as you know, Jesus said. Paul does that. Paul says, as you know, Jesus says, but James doesn't, which is, again, just an interesting thing, interesting issue for us to think about. There's a reference at the end in chapter 5, verse 14, to anointing people with oil in the name of the Lord. That there is a reference to Jesus as well, probably. But again, it's using Lord is vague in Hellenistic Greek, because that word kurios is the word that's referred to. That's the word for the name of God. That's how it's translated into the Greek Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. So all to say, it is still very vague. The coming of the Lord is near in chapter 5, verse 8. Which sounds a lot like the prophets. That's the way that Amos talks. The day of the Lord is, that's the thing that's referred to. So all to say, you can read this from a Christian perspective, but also there's a lot of continuity with what we would think of as Hellenistic Judaism. And James, the author of this letter, probably doesn't see a huge difference. Also we can say that there is a connection here, a very strong connection to wisdom literature, the wisdom tradition. We can also see a lot of connections to the Old Testament prophets. This person who wrote this is thoroughly steeped in what we would think of, Christians today would think of as the Old Testament, the scriptures to people living back then. This author is particularly influenced by books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, this wisdom tradition. The wisdom tradition in the Old Testament is it's a particular type of book, right? They're instructions written to try to help people live their lives better. But there's a theological aspect to it too. It's not just kind of practical knowledge to try to help you understand the world and how to live in it, although that's a part of it. But there's a kind of bigger framework to it, and it's very different from like Exodus, right? In the book of Exodus, people pray to God. God comes and helps them. God gives them a law. God gives them information that they would never have had. The name of God is revealed, which they couldn't just figure out any other way. Proverbs is really different. The way Proverbs tells you that the world works is that God has created the world, and It's up to us to observe the world and look for those kind of clues of wisdom that are buried in everything and how it works. I mean, the cycle of growth and death, birth, death and rebirth in the world, the way that animals work, the way that the energy works, the way that kind of there's a moral sense to the world, at least sometimes. Those are all kind of these key aspects of how God has planted clues about who God is in the midst of the world. And if you discern them and think about them and pass them down through time and listen to your ancestors who have discerned these things, and listen to other cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia, the smart people in those cultures who have noticed these things too, regardless of what God they worship, they've seen some of the things about the God who created the universe, and they've gotten some things right about that. So you listen to all these kind of wisdom and knowledge around you and use your mind and think about it. Observe the world carefully and develop wisdom intentionally, and then you can kind of figure out something about God. That's the idea of wisdom literature. So Proverbs says, yeah, look at the stars, the sky. Don't look at the stars and think, oh, those are gods. Look at the stars and think God made those things, and they're moving in certain patterns to try to teach me something about time, about, whatever. You're trying to kind of figure out kind of a moral logic to the universe, and that'll tell us something about the God who created the universe. That's the basic idea of, say, the book of Proverbs. And James seems to come from this tradition. The basic point is this is where you would go in the ancient world to learn how to be a good person, to learn like kind of what to do. So like the laws of Hammurabi don't tell you how to be a good person. The kings didn't tell you how to be a good person. Just like today, the state of Georgia doesn't tell you how to be a good person. The state of Georgia publishes laws. Also, the priests in the ancient world didn't necessarily tell you how to be a good person. The priests told you how to worship the gods right and how to sacrifice correctly, and what kind of what your obligations and duties were to the gods. But they didn't spend a lot of time telling you how to treat your mom and dad, how to treat your children. That was the world of what we call today wisdom literature. These other kind of books that were about instructing you, helping you to be a full, competent person. So that's what James is. James is coming out of that particular tradition and applying it really to this new context that has emerged in the time of Jesus. And to the author of James, there's not that much different. Jesus reveals to us some things that Moses also revealed to us about God. I think this is true. There's also maybe, I think it's good that we have James and Paul. They do balance each other some, but James provides a really important voice within early Christianity. So, wisdom literature, these ideas of teaching from experience, a lot of the stuff in James is just general wisdom. You could figure this stuff out without knowing who Jesus is. People in parts of the world that at this time in history, at the time of James, had not encountered Jesus or Judaism at all or any of those kinds of teachings might have some similar things to say about speech, right? Watch out for your tongue. That's a big thing in James. So the idea is that you can learn this from the world, from just existing in the world and being a thinking, careful person. This idea of wisdom literature that the world is organized with God's wisdom, we can see that throughout the New Testament, like John 1, the idea that there's a logos, but it's very clear in James that this is kind of the point, that James is going to think about these things, right? This is not to say that the law doesn't exist in James. The law is much more important in James than it is in Proverbs. Proverbs talks about God's teaching a bit, but it doesn't talk about Moses or the Ten Commandments. James talks about that stuff a lot. That's because James represents a later development in wisdom literature after Proverbs. A couple centuries before James, there was a book that's included in some Christian Bibles, but not all of them. It's called Sirach or Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus. All of those names refer to the same book. Not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, which has created a lot of consternation and confusion in the church. So Ben Sira or Sirach or Ecclesiasticus is part of what the Protestant church calls the Apocrypha. So they're these kind of intertestamental books that are sometimes considered partial canon or sometimes considered not included in the canon. Luther put them in an appendix at the end of his translation. But in any event, Ben Sira, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus thinks about this wisdom literature idea but then adds to it Moses and the Torah and kind of combines some traditional Jewish teachings that don't really exist in the book of Proverbs or in the book of Job. Job doesn't mention Moses and the Torah either. So all to say, like, there's this kind of synthesis that happens a couple centuries before Jesus, and the letter of James is a part of that tradition where the Torah and this kind of general wisdom literature teachings have been melded together and fused into a new kind of teaching. All together, this idea is that observe your life, and that'll help us live our lives well. I think James doesn't say this, but I assume that James thinks that Jesus is drawing from the same well of wisdom that all of the other ancient sages were drawing from, like the people who wrote the book of Proverbs. It's associated with Solomon, right? But there's lots of different names in there, actually, for the different sub-collections. Like King Lemuel's mother is someone who is the font of wisdom in Proverbs and speaks a part of the book of Proverbs and is named there as the author of it. So it's kind of a compilation of lots of different voices. So in any event, my assumption is that James thinks that Jesus is part of the wisdom of God, but bringing this kind of wisdom, observing the world and giving these sage teachings. So just to point out a couple of these similarities, like Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, go to the ant, you lazy bones, consider its ways and be wise. There's all sorts of stories, that kind of proverbs out there about the wise ants and the lazy cricket or whatever that doesn't gather up food for the wintertime and so then has problems, right? Without having any chief or officer or ruler, the ant prepares food in the summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. So the ants are always working, gathering stuff up. Why? Because it protects them in the wintertime. So we should learn from that. We should observe the world, and we should learn that God has made the world in such a way that it's going to teach us something about how we should live, right? We should learn from the ants and do the same thing, store up things for rainy days, right? And not lie there and be lazy. This is the kind of the basic ethic of Proverbs. We might call this like there's lots of other parts to this ethic, including concern over sexuality in ways that conflict with kind of modern, even conservative modern ways of thinking about sex. I mean, the ancient world is very different in lots of ways than us. But to say, like, in that, we might think of this as like a communitarian ethic. The ethic of Proverbs is work hard, help each other, don't gather up too much stuff just for yourself, right? Like the ants were working for each other when we're looking out for the community, but also don't like take things from other people, don't kind of covet things yourself, look out for one another, be productive, but also share. And this is a huge part of the book of James. This is part of James's ethic as well. So in Proverbs, we can see repeated throughout this really concern about hoarding things, storing things up too much, thinking of yourself and not thinking of the community. It's really funny. This is sometimes called a conservative ethic. Today, like American conservatism has evolved in really a very libertarian direction, in the sense that oftentimes kind of individual liberties are highlighted as a hallmark of conservative thinking. In the ancient world, it was really different. Proverbs does not think about individual liberties at all. In the ancient world, conservatism meant like a conservative communitarian ethic, a family-based ethic where we are all family. Even people who aren't related to one another are part of the community. The community comes first. So in any event, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. You could try to get ahead by cheating a bit in business, but that's an abomination. God hates that. It's disgusting to God. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath. So James is part of this world of wisdom literature when it comes to possessions, wealth, and caring for one another in community. James, just to quote a couple of bits of James here, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God who gives to all. That comes from chapter 1, verse 5. So this is kind of a motif or theme of the work, and James mentions wisdom a lot. So again, just in chapter 1, verse 1, James starts, James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in dispersion. Perhaps this is Antioch. Perhaps this is a Jewish community somewhere else, a Jewish community of Jesus followers somewhere else in Asia Minor or in somewhere outside the land, it seems, because of the dispersion, right? Being dispersed from Palestine. So, and then in verse 2, My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. So this is a part of the idea that testing, temptation, trial are an important part of faith. James comes back to this theme a couple of times. And this draws also from Hellenistic Judaism, from older traditions in the Old Testament, that God does kind of test us in order to help us to learn about ourselves. You can look at this in a negative way, that God is out there to get us. The kind of terror of the sacrifice of Isaac, which Kierkegaard has dealt with in Fear and Trembling, right? I mean, this idea that like God is kind of brutally testing us. Even the test of the cross or whatever, this can be taken in some pretty terrifying ways. I think that's a part of what James is thinking about. But also there's another way of thinking about tests, which is, none of us really know what's inside us until we are faced with choices that ask us to not just say things, but to do things. Right? A lot of us say stuff is important to us, and then when the chips are on the table, we actually learn about ourselves. That can be taken in a negative way, or it can be positive. That is, we learned about ourselves. We learned I didn't really do what I thought I would do, so I can improve. I can get better. When I test my students in Hebrew, they might fail, but that's good in the sense that it helps them to learn what they don't know, so that they can go about learning what they need to know, right? So it's a diagnostic in a way. So these tests, can be in some way helpful, James thinks. But so that comes first. But then verse 5: if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you. So God is the fount of wisdom. This is in Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear not in the sense of like being terrified of God, although that's a small part of it probably, but more like being in wonder before God, in awestruck, right? That God is awesome in the true sense of the word, overwhelming, terrifying in a way because God is so amazing and beautiful and wonderful and huge, and God made the whole universe, and so who am I, right? So this sense that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, this kind of posture of humility and of recognizing that God is big and I'm small, right? That God is great and I need to learn, right? That posture of a good learner, right? I don't know yet. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God. So that is to say, first of all, recognize that we don't know everything, and then second of all, that the font of wisdom is going to be our experiences, our observations of the world, etc. But also, God is going to be the one who's going to give that to us in some way. Also, let the believer who is lowly boast in being raised up, and the rich being brought low, because the rich will disappear. This is a second major theme of the book of James, which is about riches and poverty, which chapter 1 moves right into after talking about wisdom and so on. Let the believer who is lowly boast in being raised up, chapter 1, verse 9. Chapter 1 of James you can see as kind of like a table of contents for what the rest of the letter is going to be about. James mentions in short order all these little topics that he's going to come back to later. Not really in this order, so it doesn't exactly function like a table of contents, but there's these little things. So we'll talk about wisdom, and we'll talk about poverty and riches. I do want to mention something that might be a bit hard to read in some ways, at least in a modern context. Comes right after the bit about wisdom. Verse 6, but ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. One way of thinking about this is doubt in the sense that you aren't totally convinced of whether or not God exists or not, or something like that. These kind of mental assertions. That's probably not exactly what James is talking about here, because he uses that word double-minded, diasikos, a psyche, two-psyched, two-minded. And so that doesn't mean that necessarily that you have doubts every once in a while that God exists, or that God's real, or that God loves you. Those are fine things to doubt, in the sense that, like, just to say, today I don't know, I don't feel it. But what do you do with that? That's where James is really thinking about here. Do you go to God and ask for the wisdom then? When you say, I don't know that Jesus is real and loves me. Do you maybe start to hedge your bets, to do things that assume that Jesus isn't real or that God doesn't exist. That's being two-minded, having doubts and going to God with those doubts and saying, gosh, I don't know what to do with these things. I'm lacking in wisdom. That's what James is talking about as a positive thing. So, there's whenever you come across these words like doubt, faith, works, right? It's important to ask, like, in what way is this author using this word? Because words can mean lots of different things. We'll come back to that with faith and works in just a moment. So James also talks a lot about speech, and in chapter 1 there's a little reference to this as well about your tongues. In chapter 1 verse 26, this is connected as well to this idea that you have to do the things you say, right? That speech can kind of lead us down paths where we've put our mouth before our money in quite literal ways in James, and get ourselves into some trouble. So what James says is that there is, verse 25 of chapter 1, a perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, not being not hearers who forget, but doers who act. So don't just talk, don't be hot air, right? But also James is talking about the law of liberty, the perfect law. And of course he's thinking about, this is the same word that's translated kind of Torah, the instruction of God, or the wisdom of God, the law of God, and it's the law of liberty. One way to think about God's rules that God has given us is that they are a cage that kind of confines us. People like Jesus and James were Jews who didn't see the law that way. Lots of other Pharisees as well. That word's become a bad word in Christianity, but in Jesus' day, it meant people who tried to figure out how the law frees us, how the law gives us liberty. Now, Jesus, who would have been understood to be a Pharisee, had an internal conflict with the other Pharisees about what they were doing and the particular ways they went about this, which meant that Jesus had lots of things to say about them. But then later on, there were conflicts between Jesus followers and Pharisees, which sometimes resulted in Jesus followers getting excluded from the Jewish community. That's what we see in Matthew. That's why the Pharisees are bad guys in Matthew, because Jesus did have fights with them, because he was one of them, like you'd fight with cousins or brothers, right, or sisters. But here, also in James, this it doesn't reflect a time or a place where Jesus followers have been kicked out of the community. There's no hatred for the law here, as it is kind of represented, as it represents something that has excluded the people from the community. Instead, here. The law is liberty. So James is in line with the Pharisees. Sorry. Might have some conflicts like Jesus did with some particularities about it. But overall, the idea that the law is supposed to be something that frees us, that everyone's supposed to kind of try to engage in some way in our own lives. But that this also involves speech and action. Saying something, saying, yeah, I love to do the law, or I love to uphold it. God's law is beautiful. Right, but then you don't do anything about it. That's what James is really upset about. But James is also, interestingly, upset about the way that some people think that speech is a minor issue. But instead, James has a lot of examples that point out actually our speech, our tongues, are implements that can do, they're outsized in their influence. Because of speech, because of language itself, which creates worlds and can destroy them. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can't hurt me. That's a lie. Of course words can hurt you so badly, right? We've all experienced that, and James knows that too. Speech in James, he's going to come at this like a good wisdom literature or sage, a good that's the word people use to refer to these kind of wise folks who sit back and think a lot about the world in the ancient world, the sages. So he's like one of these sages who sits back and thinks, okay, so it's like a bridle, like this little thing steers a horse, right? That's kind of like the tongue. It's got outsized influence. Or ships and pilots. The little pilot is moving the big ship by just moving something a little bit there, right? That's like the tongue, which can control so much outside of its just a little muscle in our mouth, right? Well, no, it actually can break someone's life apart, right? Or build them up. And so James is trying to get us to see the explosive power of this little thing. And speaking of explosive power, he then also talks about forest blazes, right? A small little fire can start a giant forest blaze. And this is, the tongue is this little incendiary thing. So it's powerful. Watch out for it. And this is a very common motif in wisdom literature in the Old Testament. So the book of Proverbs talks about this a lot, precisely because it's so... it's something that it's so clear, but it's also something that we because we live in a sea of words, it's hard for us to understand sometimes. So, in any event, there's other kind of major themes of the book of James. As I said, James works on the level of basically folk sayings. Some of these coming out of the mouth of Jesus, but not quoted in James, again, which is interesting. So the Gospels are kind of in the teachings of Jesus that show up in the Gospels are also in kind of the air that James breathes, although not always associated necessarily with the person of Jesus in the book of James, but these kind of common moral teachings that James is trying to pass on to you, especially about speech, about temptation, about poverty and riches, about how we're supposed to do the things that we say we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be partial to people and so on. And again, as I said, this has kind of a communitarian ethic, and a big part of this is class divisions. Chapter 2, the whole thing is that we are not supposed to be a class-based culture. Not just in terms of titles and things like that, but in terms of the way that we interact with one another. You're not supposed to be partial to the rich. I think of like box seats at the big donors at a football game, get to sit in nice box seats and so on at the University of Georgia. I understand why those things happen, but the book of James is trying to tell us, let's not organize our whole community like that, especially our community of faith, right? Let's not organize ourselves according to wealth, because that has detrimental effects. It gets us to see people as dollar signs instead of seeing people as people. And then there's this reminder in chapter 2, verse 5, has not God chosen the poor of the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? This is quoting in a way the Sermon on the Mount, or at least alluding to some of the same ideas as in the Sermon on the Mount. And then verse 6, but you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Now, this is interesting. I see this as connected to the idea Paul is going around the world, and in Romans we see this, in Galatians he mentions it, and he mentions it in Philippians, this idea that he's kind of collecting an offering to bring to Rome. When he goes to the Romans, he's wanting to kind of collect some offerings from them, but bring it to Jerusalem. In his mind, this kind of reenacts Isaiah 2, where the nations bring their tribute on the last day to Jerusalem and learn from the Torah, all the Gentile nations showing up and voluntarily giving to Jerusalem. But also Paul talks about how this is a collection for the poor, and it's the poor in Jerusalem. It's understood that Jews living in Palestine and surrounding areas were poor. They were poor in relation to their Roman neighbors and other people from the Greco-Roman world who had access to kind of Greek culture and so on. So there's literal poverty, and there's maybe a few wealthy people. We see Paul doing the same thing in Corinthians, right? Saying a lot of the people in this community are poor, and there's a few rich people who seem to be kind of pre-gaming and hoarding a lot of stuff for themselves. Hoarding maybe in James the best seats for themselves, and kind of building themselves up, and not looking after each other. And so when James says, is it not the rich who oppress you? I mean, he's not kowtowing to the few rich people in the congregation. He's really talking to, most of you are poor. Why do you put up with this stuff, right? It's really interesting. Also to say that James is interested in power, and James is interested in getting people who think that they're without power to realize that they themselves are powerful, especially when they work together, thinking of themselves together. Like, yeah, we're oppressed by the rich. Let's think about this. And remember, he's drawing from that world of Proverbs where people who amass wealth themselves are doing it to the detriment of the community, unless they share with the community and think about the community in the way that they engage their work. But the idea in James, but also in Proverbs, is if someone's getting super rich in your small community, they're taking the money from you. It's coming from you, right? And your work. There's this thing about kind of poor people being lazy. This is kind of an old trope. In Proverbs, the poor aren't always lazy, right? The lazy bones, that guy's lazy. But the understanding is that poor people work hard in the ancient world. They're farmers. Most of these people are working super hard, and they don't have a lot of money to show for it. Not because they're lazy, but because they're growing things that aren't worth much outside of their ability to sustain their own life. That's kind of what James is talking about here, right? You all are working real hard, and you're getting most of your money taken from you. So, in any event, James is upset about this imbalance in the community. So, if you're looking for kind of an economic critique of some of the ways that our economic system is structured and works, I think a lot of the problems in our community ethos are our national economic ethos have been revealed through the COVID crisis. If you ask me, the fact that people are essential workers and have to go into work and risk their lives every day, but those also are people who are oftentimes paid minimum wage. This tells us something, right? The essential workers who we all depend on for all of the things in our daily life are people who don't get paid enough to afford an apartment, right, in most urban areas. So this is some of that contrast that we might be seeing that James might be trying to point out to us. So, love your neighbors yourself is something that James mentions, and of course, quoting from Leviticus 19. This is not uncommon within Judaism of the day. So, like Rabbi Akiva, other famous Jews from around about the time of Jesus, they all quoted this as well. You should love your neighbors yourself. Love God, love your neighbor. That was a pretty common way. Jesus didn't make this up. He was quoting from Leviticus and from Deuteronomy when he quoted that, and so did all of his, all of his Jewish neighbors. So this is a pretty kind of common thing. But then James goes back to speak of the law of liberty as well in chapter 2, verse 12. So this idea that you have been freed up so that you don't have to follow the honor-shame dynamics of the Roman world. You don't have to follow the Roman idea that like you only matter if you conquer other people and dominate them and take their stuff and become wealthy, right? That's not the only way to fame, success, right? Power, there's a different kind of power, there's a different kind of fame, there's a different kind of success. And it follows this law of liberty. When you've been freed to care for your neighbor, just as you care for yourself, that's the gospel to James. So this is also why speech is so dangerous to James, is because speech is a way for us to manipulate others, use others, hurt others, to get away from our communal responsibility. We can see that stuff happening in our world today too, I think. So we can say that James is a book in the New Testament. All New Testament books are thinking about this, but James, much more than Paul, is interested in particular questions of what we might call today social justice, right? According to this ancient conservative communitarian ethic. And so we see some of that kind of radiating around the book of James. So big question here on James is James getting upset with Paul about faith and works? Now, I think maybe that's true. Again, I said Paul has one side of the argument. Paul in Galatians, talking about the law and Judaizers and so on. I don't doubt that there were some people going around Paul's area in Asia Minor who were telling Christians or followers of Jesus who were Gentiles, who happen to be Gentiles, hey, you got to get circumcised, you got to follow the law. Remember, for Paul, he thinks no, the purpose of Jesus is that Jesus has opened up a gate within Israel that welcomes in the foreigners, the nations, the Gentiles, as themselves, for who they are. In their culture, language, history, that's kind of the miracle of Jesus to Paul. Paul also then goes on to say you don't need to follow the Torah, the kind of cultural parts of the Torah, right? Like circumcision, that's for Jews, that's not for Gentiles. So he's not saying it's bad for Jews to get circumcised. He says they should, they actually need to. That's part of their Jewish tradition, faith, culture, relationship with God. But Gentiles have a different way of relating to God, and explore that, develop that, right? Everyone doesn't need to become the same culture in order to worship the God of Israel, is what Paul says, and Jesus has made this possible. But this also means that Paul sounds a little bit like he's being negative about the law. So when Paul wrote Galatians, he was upset about this kind of Judaizing tendency within the church. He then comes back and writes Romans, where he nuances his statements about the law. I mean, it sounds in Galatians like he says the law is terrible and evil, in fact. He doesn't say that, but it can sound like that. In Romans, he tempers that a lot, makes sure to say very clearly he thinks the law is a good thing. In fact, a holy and sacred, important thing. He's kind of hedging a bit, and I think it's probably because people read Galatians or heard about Paul, right? They heard Paul's teachings or heard secondhand Paul's teachings. They said, that guy Paul's a nut because he believes that like Jews are bad. No, Paul didn't say that, right? But you can imagine it getting taken out of context, like in an ancient telephone game, right? Like someone tells someone who tells someone who tells someone, and then by that time, it doesn't sound right. Now, we might also be hearing in Paul about Jewish followers of Jesus kind of through this telephone game. Paul might not be telling us really very clearly what these Jewish communities believe, Jewish followers, Jesus followers. And James might represent that better. So here's the big fight. Paul is saying, you have to have faith. Faith is what you have to have. Works aren't important, the works of the law. You don't need to be circumcised to be saved. You don't need to be circumcised to become righteous. And he points to Abraham, and he says, yeah, look, Abraham, he wasn't circumcised yet in chapter 15 of Genesis, and he was declared righteous because he had faith. James, on the other hand, says in chapter 2, verse 21, was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith brought to completion by the works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God and was reckoned to him as righteousness. So he was justified. In verse 24, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. To a Pauline, you'd be like, what? No. Can faith save you? Yes, it can, right? So you can see that there's a tension here and a conflict. This is why Luther called James a gospel of straw, or a straw-filled letter, right? There's nothing to it. It's kind of gross and meaningless. So faith or works. Okay, now here's what I think the answer to this is that Paul and James are both right. Neither of them has to be wrong because, as we all know, words can mean different things. If I use a word faith, I might mean something different from when you use the word faith. So I think Paul uses faith differently than James does, and Paul uses works differently than James does, and Paul talks about the law in different ways than James does. And they're both right. So Paul is talking about how apart from works, which he means as works of the law, which he means being culturally Jewish. He says justification, like you being okay with God, does not have to do with these works of the law. You don't need to be circumcised if you're a Gentile to be okay with God. Paul's circumcised, and he thinks that's a good thing because he's a Jew. So what he's saying is that's a different question than are you justified? Is God okay with you? Paul says that happens through faith. But in Paul's letters in Romans, we can see very clearly that faith is not an idea. Faith for Paul is doing something. That Greek word pistis, which Paul's word, which was translated in English into faith, it comes throughout Paul's letters. We can see that clearly for Paul, this is about like an active trust. So if I tell you, hey, do you believe that chair can hold you up? And you say, yeah. And I say, well, then go sit in it. And you say, no, I won't do that. Paul would say, well, you don't really believe then. Believing means actually trusting in it to the point that you're going to do it. If you believe that God exists, then it's going to change the way you act if you really believe it. So for Paul, true faith is also bound up with all the stuff that you do, the way you live your life. You're not going to live it perfectly, but you're going to live it in a very different way than if you didn't believe. James has a very different way of thinking about these words, faith and works. For James, faith means not an active trust. For James, he really means it in the sense of believe. How do I know that? Because chapter 2, verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Now, I don't think James is saying that demons trust that Jesus is their Lord and Savior, right? He's saying that demons believe that there is a God. And yet they fight against this God because they don't believe that this God is the way, right? That they're going to, by fighting against this God, they're going to get what they want. So for James, he believes that faith, he's using that word to mean really propositions of the mind. Kind of what most people mean today by faith. Do you believe in God? Paul would be like, well, you can say yes to that, but if you don't do anything about it, then clearly you don't believe. James, which is true, right? But James also says, well, I mean, yeah, you can say you believe in God, but if you're not doing it, then you might have faith, but you're not actually a believer, right? So it's a nuance, right? So James in this chapter is using faith to mean ideas. Paul is using faith to mean a way of life. I can imagine that this kind of conflict actually led Paul and lots of Jewish followers of Jesus to have lots of fights, right? Galatians would have made no sense to someone who is using James's vocabulary. Did they sit down and work this out someday? I don't know. We don't have that on paper, right? Maybe Romans is Paul's way of trying to work through this argument. But all to say, I think there's a way to read both of it. Both of them as really agreeing with each other and arguing in terms of using different words. So again, for Paul, Abraham's justified by faith, not works. Because Abraham believed and left his home and his family and conducted his life in such a way that he trusted God. He didn't do the works of the law. He hadn't been circumcised yet, but and other Jewish cultural practices. However, he and he hadn't received the Torah. He didn't know all the 512 legislations. But he believed and trusted, and that was what led to God reckoning him righteous in Genesis 15. For James, Abraham is justified by works. So we can see from this, James doesn't mean the works of the law, because Abraham didn't have those yet. What James clearly means is he was justified by his works, that is, his good deeds. He did stuff. So in James, works means good deeds. Are you doing good? That's works. Paul doesn't really mean that when he says works. Just to summarize, faith and works. Paul, faith is a way of living. For James, faith is a mental belief. And those are fine. Both of those are fine definitions of that word faith. We're arguing about the definition of a word then. Then for Paul, works refers to Jewish Torah observance. And for James, works means good deeds. Both are true. I think both have a very similar way of understanding faith and works. I think there's some nuances of difference which are important for us to keep in mind. But in terms of an overview of James, I think we're gonna have to stop there. I would also recommend James chapter 3 verses 13 through 18. These two different kinds of wisdom. What is true wisdom? The notion in chapter 5 as well that. It's in chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, the judging it reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. In chapter 5, there's more that sounds like the Sermon on the Mount or Jesus' parables and so on. So your gold and silver have rusted, their rust will be evidence against you in chapter 5. Your riches have rotten and are moth-eaten, right? Where you put your treasure, your heart is there also. But important too, chapter 5, verse 4 of James, listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. This is quoting and changing Abel's, the story of Cain and Abel. Cain murders Abel, and why it's kind of unclear. It's not clear in the story, but a lot of people have summarized it's because they were jealous, or Cain was jealous of Abel, or that Cain wanted Abel's stuff. Again, the story itself does not say that very clearly, but this idea that the wages of laborers who have been stolen by the employers of these people has been kind of kept back by fraud, and the wages themselves cry out like Abel's blood to God. That is, and this, think about it like this. The poor people's wages are their lifeblood, right? That's the food they're going to eat. That's the health care that their kids their babies are going to get, right, and use. Their lives depend upon each dollar more than mine does. So, hey, then this is a really interesting teaching and kind of conclusion here from James is that the things that we might think of as kind of like a little entries in a ledger are actually life and death questions to a lot of people who depend on our system helping them rather than hurting them. In a time of COVID right now, there are lots of people who are out of work, unemployed, and their lives are completely dependent. And they worked hard for a long time, and they might even, some of them still be working hard, but they might not be provided for, and their lives might be in danger. James tells us that Jesus, really he uses God here, but God is listening for the cry. That word is really important there, cry out. That is translation of an ancient Hebrew word, sa'ak, which is what the blood does from Abel. It's also what the Israelites do. The Hebrews, when they're enslaved in Egypt, they cry out, and that God hears. God is especially attentive to this kind of crying out, and that God comes and acts, because vulnerable people, James talks about the widows and the orphans, that is crucial in the Old Testament. That's one thing that sets Israel apart, is that they actually provide for widows and orphans, and that God actually cares about them. And in Exodus chapter 20, and part of the law, God says, I'm going to fight for them. I'll fight for the widows and orphans. And if you're the one who say you love me, but you're going to get in the way of the widows and orphans and try to take advantage of them, or the wandering aliens, if you try to oppress any of these people, I'll fight you, God says. That's throughout the Old Testament. But so James sums this up in chapter 1, verse 27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. That unstained by the world part, kind of not being tempted, as James says, to kind of be of two minds, right? Try to get, go to church to pray so that you can then go to oppress people at work the next day. But religion is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to take care of orphans and widows in their distress. This is quoting the Old Testament. This is quoting the law. So, of course, I think that's a crucial and important thing for us to think about today. There's a couple of other things I should say. I know we don't have a lot of time to cover 2 Peter, but I'll just say this. 2 Peter is not from the author of 1 Peter, even though it's written in the name of Simon Peter, but it seems to reflect a very different time and place than 1 Peter does. It's also by many people understood to be the latest, like the last text written in the New Testament, perhaps even after Revelation, in part because it refers to the Gospels, to Paul's letters, and to the other Catholic epistles, the general epistles. It knows more of the Bible, more of the New Testament, than other New Testament books seem to know. So it's kind of a tip for us. But another thing, too, is that a big part of 2 Peter is managing these frustrated expectations that the end had not come. So the apostles have all died. This is kind of referred to in chapter 3, that the apostles have died and Jesus didn't come back. So what are we supposed to do then? So there's a very sharp expectation about apocalypticism in Paul's letters. Paul thinks that in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, don't worry about getting married because Jesus can come back tomorrow, right? Or whatever, sometime soon. It's like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic to get married. Why would you get married now when Jesus can come back so soon? Well, clearly, after a generation goes by, some people who are like, well, Paul, I didn't get married. Like, what? And, now I'm, like, I could have lived my life really differently, right? Paul probably would have said, well, you dedicated your life to the gospel, so that's good. But you can imagine some people getting frustrated to say, Jesus didn't come back, and, like, I didn't have a retirement account, So all to say, 2 Peter is trying to help people understand that, years have gone by, all the apostles are gone, Jesus didn't come back. We don't know the time or the hour that's going to come. It's a shift in the terms of the time, in terms of the expectation of the end. There's other things about 2 Peter that are interesting and important, but let me just say this in terms of relating it to Jude, which is the shortest book in the New Testament. Jude, only one chapter of Jude. Well, I guess it's like Philemon in that sense. It's very, very short book. So if you hear someone say Jude 17, that doesn't mean Jude chapter 17. It means Jude verse 17. But Jude and Peter also participate in a very interesting kind of Jewish exegesis of the day. They seem to know the book of Enoch. And the Enochic materials. 2 Peter less so than Jude, but Jude is fascinating. Also, Jude seems to be actually Palestinian. That is, it's Jewish. It seems to actually reflect in some ways Judaism in the day. There's huge arguments about when it was written. Some very early, some very late. But just know that it's indulging in some really fascinating Jewish exegesis of texts that didn't become part of the Jewish or Christian canons for most Christians. So like in verse 14 of Jude, Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, "See, the Lord is coming." This is a quotation from the book of 1 Enoch, popular in Jesus' day, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least kind of referenced in their community, and fascinating and important book, but also not currently canon. So in any event, it's mainly about sexual propriety, which is interesting in and of itself. I can come back and talk about Jude sometime later, but I feel like I've gone on too long now. But may the Lord be with you and bless you and keep you, and may we one day meet again.